CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you, as always, from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria, where we will take a look at BC's new housing list for municipalities, lessons from the Alberta election, and our ongoing by-elections, along with some other stuff. With the Pod Squad, we're going to bring in quickly Jeff, Jillian, and Allie joining us to break everything down as they do each and every week, trying to make sense of this crazy mixed up world in which we live. Thank you for being here, all of you. Let's talk about the naughty list. In this case, the BC Housing naughty list. That's the naughty list. The CRTC doesn't let us talk about any other naughty lists. It is a phrase coined by the housing minister himself, Ravi Kahlon, in an unfortunate turn of phrase this week. But essentially, 10 municipalities the BC government has put on notice to build more housing faster or else risk getting big-footed out of the way by the province. The list, which we'll put up if you're watching on the TV version here: Saanich, Victoria, Oak Bay, Vancouver, North Van, West Van, Delta, Abbotsford, and Port Moody, and then the only rural community being Kamloops. So some surprises on there we'll talk about, I guess. I'm at Victoria, where they have a missing middle strategy and a mayor who the NDP can count on to say positive things on any subject at any time. Still makes the list, but what do we think of it? Allie, why don't we start with you? The list and what municipalities are kind of reacting to and making of being called out like this.
So the NDP are very strategic in their communications. I've consistently said this, and this is no different. I honestly think this is a little bit of a shield, because rather than taking full responsibility for creating housing affordability on their own accord, what they've strategically done here is essentially now they're going to put the blame on the municipality if things don't get built. And so now with the blame shift, they no longer have to say, well, we tried and we couldn't do it. Vancouver didn't do it, or Kamloops didn't do it. So it's out of our hands. Yeah, and it makes, the municipalities have turned around and said back to the province, well, we can only approve private developers who come to us. And in some communities like Oak Bay, obviously, the answer tends to be no, because there's shadows or, construction noise or whatever. But they have to people have to come forward and want to build as well. Jeff, what do you think of the blame game part of that and the list overall?
Well, in fairness, the NDP has already shifted the blame to where it belongs, and that's on Rich Coleman and the BC Liberals. But no, look, if you aim for nothing, you're going to hit it every time. So now you have Premier Eby directing local governments to set their housing goals high and don't stop until they get it done. It's a foundational move. It puts pressure on everyone, including the province, to make sure that housing supply gets approved quickly in communities where we need it the most. It's smart policy and good politics. It's not the best name, naughty list, but I was happy to see most of the mayors representing the communities who are on the list saying, we're on board with this. We think it's a good idea. We should have targets. It's the right way forward. We're happy that the province is doing this now. Let's get to it.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to speak out against David Eby if I was a municipal leader at this point. Look at BC Housing in Atira. You just get run straight out of the province if you're on the Premier's bad side when it comes to housing. And on Rich Coleman, I will say, sometimes I squint and there are some similarities in the housing kind of sense that, I remember Coleman just being one of those guys who was like, man, get it done, build it. And sometimes you get that sense from this Premier too. It's like, just get it done and build it. So there are some similarities there. I don't know. Jillian,
they'll be really happy to hear you say that.
Yeah, that one's good. The New Democrats will be really pleased with that. Yeah. Jillian?
Yeah, well, this is sort of like the first necessary stage required by the legislation as the government has written it. The end point of the legislation is that the government has given themselves powers to either issue a permit that a municipality hasn't issued, or to require a municipality to pass a new bylaw, which could affect zoning or something like that. So, but that's sort of like the last point, because that's obviously, a lot of these housing projects can be locally controversial. they can get really political. So the government has set up the legislation so that it's a phased approach where first they, put the municipalities on notice, then they set the targets. The targets are coming, I think, later this summer. And then there's incentives for the local governments to meet those. And then the end point is that the government comes in and uses a stick. So I think because, the end point is likely to be, if they have to use it, is going to be controversial, especially in some municipalities that didn't welcome the changes as much, like West Vancouver and Oak Bay, that were, a little bit more cautious about their response to this. That's going to end up potentially in a little bit of a fight. So the government wants to, give people, especially people living in those ridings, a lot of notice before it has to use those stronger measures that might end up being a little bit more controversial. So this is just the beginning of the implementation of this new policy from the government. It'll be interesting to see how it develops down the line.
Yeah. Jillian, staying with you, to extend that, the timing of all of that, as New Democrats kind of explained it, I can't see it happening before mid-2024, before, that process, plus the first step is to appoint an advisor if a municipality doesn't meet a housing target, kind of like a school board. You bring the advisor in and they report. This government wouldn't be able to start kicking a municipality around until mid-2024, right before the next provincial election. I kind of wonder if that dynamic and that timing, is that going to make it more awkward for the government or better for them to be seen as strong right before an election, depending, I guess, on the riding? Watch out, Murray Rankin in Oak Bay, if that happens in Oak Bay. But I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I definitely think, the closer we get to an election, of course, the more of a political lens is going to be put on those decisions. And I think, in competitive NDP ridings, we might see those ideas postponed, whereas in ridings like West Vancouver, where the NDP doesn't tend to be competitive, we might see them go a little bit more scorched earth if there isn't the type of progress that they want to see. But yeah, it is a long time, but it's also not. I mean, these projects take a really, really long time to get to fruition, to get through all of the different approvals and funding and permitting stages, even if you have a supportive and willing government. So yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit probably frustrating for people to see that want to see the fruits of this policy come quickly because of how urgent the housing situation is. It's going to take some time to actually implement.
Mm-hmm. Allie, building on what you were saying, like if you step back from this, and a lot of people are probably thinking, okay, great, build more so that affordability is better. Either rents are down or prices are down. And, the NDP had Tom Davidoff, a respected UBC housing professor, at the announcement, who said, not only there, but in interviews the next day, this isn't bringing prices down. Like, it's good and it should be done. But in terms of affordability, that's not on the menu, I think was his actual kind of quote. And so I wonder, like, from the public's point of view, having a municipality pressured to build more, those projects taking so long, the disconnect between the sort of political promise of affordability and the reality of whatever, this is going to be by the time there's a next election. Like, how difficult is it for the public to reconcile with that? And does it leave any openings for critics?
Well, on the topic of affordability and the housing supply, I mean, that doesn't come till much, much later. We're not going to see the benefit of that until we have enough supply that prices can go down. So that's not going to get fixed within the next 365 days. So on that point, it's just not a concept that's going to work, right? We just need more supply. But on the housing affordability, that's where government can then potentially come in and help those who need it. So there was a commitment for single parents. There's commitments for women fleeing domestic violence. There's a certain community that we have an obligation to help. That's just the most compassionate thing to do. But for everybody else, I mean, you're not going to see it for another few years, maybe even a decade. Which is a challenge, Jeff, when you're a premier who promised sort of visible progress on the file. I think conceivably he'll be able to break ground on maybe some projects and show that this time next year on the eve of an election. But if he can't, if rents are still up and sale prices are rebounding, what is the value of this in the mind of the public, do you think, a year and a half from now?
Yeah, no, I think it's there's not one thing that's going to bring affordability to Vancouver's housing market. It's going to be a whole host of measures working together, this being one of them. I'm sure government is now thinking, wow, why did we invite that expert to our press conference? But but in fairness, Tom Davidoff's a smart guy, and he's right on with the point. A couple of points I want to make are, I'm happy to see that the metric is availability of the right housing supply. So when the province was making its calculations about which local governments to focus on, it wasn't so much about how much housing is coming on, but is it housing that's going to meet the needs of low, modest income, middle class families, which I think is important in some of the groups that Allie talked about in her response. And I think the other message is that I think it's less about the 10 who are on this list, but it's more about a message to the next 10, because the housing minister said, these are the first 10. There's going to be another list of 8 to 10 coming down the pipe. I saw from folks who are on this list, Ken Sim, you'd think he'd act like Gary's Old Town Tavern, wanting to fight Cheers, but instead he sidled up to the premier like they were Cliff Clavin and Norm Peterson on this. So I don't think it's about creating conflict with these or picking fights with these councils. It's about sending a message to the next 10. You need to get focused on this too, so that we can have those results ahead of the next election.
Maybe if the NDP moves fast enough, they can add 10 more and then just get up to 87 by the time we reach the election. Just have everybody on the list. But
not a bad idea, Rob.
As always, providing helpful ideas politically. All right, let us switch provinces. Alberta's election was this week. Danielle Smith's United Conservative Party back in power. The vote was a bit tighter than maybe they'd hoped for, but our wondrously bizarre first-past-the-post system can take a close popular vote and translate it into a strong majority. That's what happened here, and so we're looking at this from the outside, and obviously Alberta is very different, but are there any lessons BC's political parties can take away from the campaign and the results there? Jeff, why don't we stay with you?
Well, sure. Look, Rachel Notley, I'm going to speak for the NDP. She got more votes, actually, and a greater percentage of the vote than she did in 2015. She got 44% versus 40% when she won. So it was actually a big win for Jason Kenney and Unite the Right in Alberta. But the question was about what are the lessons for here in BC? And I've got one for Kevin Falcon and one for David Eby. And for Kevin Falcon, the lesson is that going negative is not enough. If you think trashing your opponent is the sure path to victory, you may as well be Arthur Carlson dropping turkeys from a helicopter and expecting them to fly. You need to offer voters something positive that connects with their hopes and aspirations. Rachel Notley and the NDP did that to a certain extent, but it was drowned out by the negative that they directed at Danielle Smith, and so they failed to deliver the votes needed for victory. So negativism is not enough, Kevin Falcon. But for David Eby, pay attention to the small towns. Notley won big in the cities of Edmonton and Calgary with her message that is, better education, better healthcare, strong leadership. BC NDP here is strong in urban centers like Vancouver and Victoria. But if the NDP wants to hold on to power and have a path that goes through smaller towns, it needs to do more to connect with rural voters, I think. I think there's opportunities for there in forestry on value-added investment and jobs that the Premier's talking about. In mining, faster permits for critical minerals would be nice, and advancing Indigenous-led economic reconciliation projects. So, message to Premier from Alberta is deliver in a way rural BC can feel and understand, or be careful because its working class voters will go to the opposition.
Mm-hmm. It is an eerily similar kind of rural-urban split to what we have in British Columbia, obviously with different numbers. But you're right, in BC, the NDP does very well in the urban centers, Victoria, Vancouver, and then, BC United takes it from there, a bit like in Alberta. Allie, what do you think?
That's exactly it. Jeff's exactly right. This urban city divide, we're going to see it here in the next election, just like we've seen in previous years. I mean, the UCP had cabinet ministers, good cabinet ministers, who lost and who lost by a very razor-thin margin. And so what I think is going to end up happening for the UCP is that they're going to really have to spend a lot more time in the city and figure out what hope are we giving to people and families who live in the city. And that's essentially what we'll potentially see here in the next election too. So if BC United continues to just focus on our strongholds, then we're going to completely miss out on talking to families within the Lower Mainland. And Danielle Smith didn't quite figure that out, that switch, in that you do need to offer something. You do need to offer good policy within the city, because that's what people are paying attention to. City voters tend to be people who are paying attention to policy rather than inherently card-carrying members of any political party. Those are just like the stats and the facts. And they're more likely to switch votes on political parties depending on good ideas, rather than just because I've voted this way for generations and generations. So good ideas are going to win any city.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think of it that way, for sure. Jillian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, in terms of sheer political campaigning, one thing that stood out to me was just how important it is to have a really smart strategy around your leader and how you're sort of portraying them as a person. We saw, Jeff mentioned the NDP going really negative on Danielle Smith. There was a lot of great opposition research that, should have been really strong fodder. She entered the campaign with really high negatives, but her team was able to turn that around just within the course of the campaign, which is, I think just shows how important that still is. The other thing that stood out to me is just that I think that there is a continued trend from COVID where people are feeling still a lot of instability and looking for, sort of like a going with often like the devil that they know, and sticking with sort of, a don't change horses in the middle of the stream kind of vote choice. That stood out to me. And I think that's something that we could kind of see play out, and maybe explains why we're seeing the persistence of such high vote intention numbers for the NDP, despite those, lower issue approval ratings that we talked about so much.
And I'll add maybe, and it kind of builds a little on what Jeff said, that there is an echo chamber, obviously, in politics, especially in the social media world, and that kind of burning hatred that one party might feel towards the leader of another party, or the kind of dismissiveness and the attempts to portray them as sort of evil, doesn't always, it's not always reality in the real world. The ordinary voters don't see it maybe the same way as the echo chamber for, in this case, the NDP, I think, in trying to make Danielle Smith be a villain, but also her party being able to help to counter that in the campaign. So yeah, interesting, although I'm not sure, Alberta is so different. It's hard to take too much of that, but it does lead into our next topic, which is BC by-elections. We have 2 mini campaigns out right now after David Eby called the by-elections in Vancouver, Mount Pleasant, and Langford-Juan de Fuca. They're set for June 24th. I'm not so sure the outcomes are in doubt here in 2 of the safest NDP ridings in the province, but what are we looking for here, I think, from strategies, from campaigns, and from the way the parties might be positioning themselves? Allie?
So by-elections are a great time to signal what the message could be in the upcoming general election. And I think for all political parties, we might potentially see some of this. Certainly with BC United, I said this a few weeks ago, we need to elect more mothers and fathers and people who are fighting for their families, and they have that with their candidate. And so that she's young, she has a young family. It's the ideal candidate that BC United would want to attract, particularly within the Lower Mainland, as we talk about that urban-rural divide. And so maybe this is a little bit of a signal as to what BC United is thinking for their candidate recruitment. But then we also have to remember all eyes are on the by-elections too. So even if you're watching from Fort St. John, you're potentially picking up on a couple of things that might happen in the general.
Yeah, and the testing of those themes, I guess, Jillian, gives some freedom to the parties to kind of put some things out there in this campaign and see where they land and see if the public is as upset as they might think they are in certain areas, or their messaging is kind of picking up and their criticisms of each other and where those sort of things land.
Definitely. And it's also, in addition to that, you can get great information from just having the opportunity to canvass and talk to voters and seeing how they respond to your messages. But also you can get opportunity to train your campaign staff and volunteers through getting that sort of door-to-door voter contact training. And you see, the parties trying out different strategies. Allie talked about BC United, and the Greens are running in Langford on a really strong healthcare message with a healthcare advocate as their candidate. Yeah, and then I think, as we get the results, it'll be interesting to see if there's any trends we can pick apart. They are very safe NDP ridings. I think the NDP got, upwards of 60% in both of them the last time. They're both ridings where the Greens get second, which makes them interesting. And I was looking at the numbers for Langford in particular. That wasn't always the case. They actually switched places with BC United in 2020, so they went from third to second. So it'll be interesting to see if that on the island in particular, because if the Greens are going to pick up seats next time, that's one of their strongest areas. If they can really, that's a persistent trend, and if the BC United continues to be just a non-factor on the island, and if they can sort of work towards, if they don't win this time, mitigating some of that strategic voting issue that we see play out in the provincial elections that always hampers them on the island.
Mm-hmm. Jeff?
If your government by-elections stink, you hate them. There's no real reason, especially with the majority, for folks to get fired up to go out and vote for government. I mean, the NDP's got two really good candidates, Ravi Parmar and Joan Phillip, and success is going to be winning both of those seats. But I wouldn't be surprised to see the vote share down, because by-elections are tough for government. Opposition, which in these two ridings can't, in a general election, marshal resources in the same way that they can in focused by-elections, can use their best organizers and put together a really strong voter identification and ground game and get folks out to vote and get folks who are upset about things government are doing fired up to vote. So it's a good opportunity for opposition to make some gains. For Kevin Falcon, I think success has got to be measurable gains in these by-elections.
Okay, great. We will pick up on the by-elections as the campaign continues. For now, though, we're going to leave it there and come back next week with all the latest in BC politics. Stay with us. Make sure you watch on CHEK Plus, YouTube, or subscribe for audio content extras in the podcast. We'll be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital.